All right, ladies, gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, we are really excited y'all are here. We know your time is valuable. We know you're spending hard-earned money on this, and we are aiming to bring you a fantastic weekend. Great lineup of speakers, a whole bunch of events, and I'm stoked. Our inaugural speaker, my friend and one of my favorite people to hear talk. We talk about different roles in the liberty movement, and this is one person who is truly out there doing the work in every single way. It is my honor to introduce Sound Money Defense League, JP Cortez.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Rob, Libertarian Party, Ryan, James. Thank you for all the fantastic hosts for letting me be a part of this great event. Like Rob said, my name is JP Cortez. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Sound Money Defense League. We're based right in Charlotte. We've been doing this since 2014. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. So we'll start with sound money. You know, what are we talking about when we say sound money? The Sound Money Defense League, what are we defending? Sound money refers to money that is tested by the market and has little or no wild swings in purchasing power up or down. This is money that's consistent in its value, not because a government said that it is money, not because a government applied a special designation or a legal tender status, but because the market tested it. And upon being tested by those market forces, it came out as a reliable hedge against inflation, a reliable store of value. For thousands of years, what we've been talking about when we're talking about assets that describe or that fit those categories that I just described, we're talking about gold and silver. We're talking about the only form of money mentioned in the Constitution, one of the only forms of money prominently mentioned in the Bible, one of the only forms of money with thousands of years of price history and monetary history. And to their credit and to our benefit, the founders of this country knew the perils that came with paper money. They called it a lottery upon all private property. They said that if you look at Madison's writing, he said that with paper money, it's all deceit and it can all be lotted away. This is what they meant. What we're currently living under is what they meant, excuse me. For the last 50 years or so, we've moved away from a sound money standard. In 1971, Richard Nixon famously closed the gold window, which is ending foreign convertibility of gold. There was a time in American history where you used to be able to take your dollars to a bank, and that bank would then exchange those paper notes for actual gold, because the money, the currency, was a representation. It was not in and of itself a trust or a promise. It was a representation of actual gold sitting somewhere in a safe or in a depository. That's not the case today. Today we're living under a fiat system, which is to say that the government decides what your money is, what it's worth, how and when you can spend it, and how and when you can't, and a number of other restrictions that come with the government being in control and having a monopoly over money, which is the system we live in today. So the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 10 says that no state shall make anything but gold and silver gold and silver coin a tender in the payment of debts. The reason for this is twofold. There are two main value propositions when it comes to sound money. The first is that it protects capital and it allows you to make plans. If I'm planning 10, 20, 30 years into the future, if I'm trying to build civilization, if I want to build infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals, communication towers, all of this requires long-term planning. And if I don't know what my money will be worth tomorrow or a year from now or 10 years from now, it makes it a lot less likely and a lot more difficult for entrepreneurs, for enterprising people to create and to help build the infrastructure that is necessary for things like longer lifespans, for things like better happiness in life. All of these things are based on our ability to plan. One of the greatest assets that human beings have is our capacity to problem solve. And when money is errant, and when money cannot be trusted or cannot be counted on to hold value, it makes it impossible to plan for the long term. The second value proposition of sound money is that it protects against a government that would otherwise spend past its means on things that the populace would never support if they had to do so through direct taxation. What I'm talking about is wars of choice. I'm talking about increased and bloated bureaucracies. I'm talking about entitlement systems that largely amount to Ponzi schemes. All of this is not only incentivized, but it is enabled by a system where the government gets to have a printing press and decide what money's worth and how much of it is out in circulation. This would not be possible. What I'm saying, please hear me when I say that at least since 1971, America has engaged in wars of choice. And right now, we have another opportunity to examine this, and we can see if you can draw a straight line. There's a direct correlation between a country's capacity to fund war and their willingness to fight it. This matters not necessarily or just on an individual level or just on a community level, but what I'm talking about is generations in the future, places most Americans can't find on maps, and we're dropping bombs or giving money to drop bombs all over the world. And to what end? Americans are not any safer. The debt continues to grow in an unsustainable way. Our liberties, our securities are gone at the expense of quote-unquote safety. And the Constitution is trampled on over and over again. Mises, Ludwig von Mises, famous economist and namesake of the Mises Institute down in Auburn, Alabama, where I had the great pleasure of studying Austrian economics for several years while I got my degree at Auburn, said that the classical or orthodox gold standard should be counted among constitutional safeguards. What he's saying is that as important as your right to assemble, as important as your right to bear arms, is your right to a free and stable sound money. And as Americans, this is your birthright. Constitutionally, it is enshrined that you should have a money based in gold and silver to protect against the theft that inflation is. Because our founders knew that if they had their way, politicians would continue to print, would continue to fight wars, would continue to spend on pet projects, all at the expense of the American taxpayer. And that's what we've seen, and that's exactly what has happened. So, what can we do about it? Of course, everyone in this room probably knows the name Ron Paul, probably holds him in high esteem, and there has been no greater champion for sound money politically in decades. He is credited, and rightfully so, for popularizing the phrase, "end the Fed." We understand that it's this institution at the top where the sewage flows from. This is a cabal, an unelected group of bureaucrats that has a monopoly over our money. You can spend decades of your life working your ass off and saving so that you and your family and your children can live a comfortable life. And then with a snap of a finger, bureaucrats can put a couple of zeros at the end of the money supply, and everything you've worked for has been diluted. These are basic principles of dilution that we've all understood since childhood. If you have wine and you add water to it, the potency of that wine has diminished. And that's what happens every day when the government prints money and pumps it into our monetary supply. I don't need to explain currency debasement to the people in this room, but very briefly, I'm sure y'all know, 1913, arguably the worst year in American history. You have direct election of senators, you have the income tax, and you have the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. Shortly after that, we had the Great Depression, we had World War II, which was scales bigger than previous wars that came before it. We had the Korean War, we had Vietnam War, we had all of the Middle East. Ron Paul said it's no surprise that the century of central banking coincides with a century of war. And he was right. In 1933, gold ownership became banned. The government said, no, no more. You must turn this in, and they expropriated all of Americans' gold. In 1971, like I said earlier, Nixon closed the gold window. And since then, we've seen the effects of these policies. We've seen it harder and harder for people my age, younger and older, to do basic things like afford a home, to buy groceries and basic necessities, to buy means of transportation, to afford housing, healthcare. Humans, Americans, are being priced out of these because inflation is not an act of God. This was not a natural disaster. This does not happen on accident. These were policy decisions that were made by our betters, quote unquote, for our benefit, they say. 2008, you have the Great Recession, largely caused by the manipulation of interest rates. More recently, COVID-19. And not COVID-19, more specifically, the government's response to COVID-19. Because those are different. We talk often about how COVID caused a shutdown. COVID caused an increase of 40% in the money supply. COVID caused mental health illness and suicide rates and general depression rates hitting all-time highs. No, they didn't. It was the government that said you can't own a business. It was the government that said you can't go to church. You can't spend time with your friends. Thanksgiving dinner, make sure you keep it to 6 or less and make sure it's outdoors. But Governor Newsom of California had no problem being at the French Laundry, the Michelin star restaurant in California. Nancy Pelosi had no problem getting her nails done and getting her hair done, while the rest of us were forced to live under totalitarian rule. We're forced to shut down. It's 2 weeks to slow the spread, y'all. Y'all remember that? And so at every opportunity, the government has tested the trust that this system is built on. And pretty undeniably, they've failed virtually all of these tests. They have shown that they cannot be trusted, not with our liberties, certainly not with our tax dollars. So the Sound Money Defense League, the argument is that while this problem is largely federal, this problem extends or starts at the Federal Reserve level, starts in Congress, and then flows downward. The monetary dysfunction that we live under is largely a result of those two parties. But that doesn't mean that states have to sit idly by while their money is debased and while their citizens are wrecked. So what we found is that the Constitution calls for gold and silver as money, but none of us today use gold and silver. Of course not. Why would we? We have fiat Federal Reserve notes, and the reality is, so long as tax authorities and vendors are willing to accept Federal Reserve notes, spending gold and silver transactionally is dumb. It works against your interest. If you were to spend gold today using it as money, you're going to get hit with a state capital gains tax, a federal capital gains tax, and a transaction fee through whatever service you're using. So today it's not functional as money, not because gold and silver failed, not because the gold standard failed, and that's important, because the gold standard did not fail, not on its own merits. It was killed. The gold standard was killed by dishonest politicians who don't like honest money that tied their hands. The money supply serves as handcuffs. We can limit our government through their capacity to fund these things. And if we take away their power to do that, the hope is that we'll have a government that is a better steward, not just of our dollars, but of our freedoms. So what can states do? They can remove all of the impediments and the thistle and the briar standing in the way of people actually using gold and silver as money. This, in North Carolina, I'm talking about in the form of taxes. Back in 2017, we worked to remove precious taxes on the purchase of precious metals here. Now we're working to remove the capital gains tax. And these are the two biggest points of friction. When you spend or when you buy precious metals, in some states, you're going to get hit with a sales tax. When you spend those precious metals, you're going to get hit with a capital gains tax. There's too much friction currently for gold and silver to function as money. So what do? We need to remove all of the impediments and all of the obstacles standing in the way of not only gold and silver being used as money, but also of enterprising people innovating within this space. F.A. Hayek, Nobel Prize winning economist, says that money was captured and it was frozen in time, and for nearly a century there has been no innovation, no modernization. What if money could look completely different than how we imagine it today? And there's no way to know, because the government has put brakes on this entire industry. So to free it, the goal is to free it to competition, to free it away from this monopoly that the government currently holds on money. There are state proposals that governments can pursue and can enact, like I said. There are also state proposals that governments should avoid. Many of these things, and the reason I say this, it's a timely topic because we're seeing this all over the country. I've been on airplanes over the last 6 weeks probably. I've been on dozens of flights going state to state, fighting a policy that's being proposed that I'm talking about you here today because this policy might come to North Carolina. And when it does, I'm counting on y'all to fight with me because frankly, grassroots pressure is among the strongest, most powerful tools that y'all, that citizens, that we have to affect change at the state level, at least. Because the reality is at the federal level, we don't have a lot of power. And political efficacy is at an all-time low, and that's not on accident. The truth is, if you were to call a congressman today to talk about an issue, you'll probably get a machine. An aide might or might not receive your message. They might or might not pass it over to the congressman, who might or might not send you a form letter in response telling you, thank you so much for participating in the democratic process. I really appreciate hearing from you, and I will take your thoughts into consideration. And that's as far as it'll go. And that's the reality of the gridlock that is federal electoral politics and policy. But that's not true at the state level. That's not true in Raleigh, North Carolina, or Lincoln, Nebraska, or Nashville, Tennessee, or Salem, Oregon. At this level, at the state level, you have power. And if you take nothing else from what I say tonight, it's that at the state level, you have power to affect change, unlike you do at the federal level. All it takes is a handful of phone calls, a handful of emails, because state legislatures are not used to organize grassroots pressure. And your capacity to affect change is so much stronger at the state level. And frankly, that's where it matters. Federal electoral politics are largely a clown show. This is a circus. Amen. What affects you, what affects your family, what affects your children, the schools they go to, the security that you have around you, the infrastructure, the energy costs, all of these things that affect your life on in a very legitimate and active way, those are issues decided in Raleigh. So please, I mean, there's a lot, especially social media makes it hard. There's a lot to be said about politics at the federal level. Everyone's recording TikToks, we're doing things in Capitol Hall. Please don't forget that your power is largely in your voice, and your voice has real power in the halls of places like your state legislatures. This policy that I mentioned, that's worth mentioning, I talk about it because on its face, on paper, you could see how a liberty-minded person might say, hey, this is a good idea, let's do this. And then you dig a little deeper and you find that that's not the case, many such cases. What I'm talking about is what's called a transactional gold bill. And these bills, it's a vendor, of course, going state to state, introducing legislation that calls for the government, the state government, to entangle itself in a private-public partnership where the state government would have management and oversight over the way people in that state buy, sell, store, and use precious metals. They're saying that this is in the name of liberty, in some cases even referencing Ron Paul. It's nonsense. Gold and silver are alternative assets outside of the Federal Reserve System, and the reason most people buy gold and silver in the first place is because they understand the danger and the problem that flows from the federal level and with our monetary policy. Those same people are not eager then to give their gold back to the government and say, yes, I trust you to manage this system. The truth is, the federal government doesn't even audit its own gold in Fort Knox. And the reality is, this is a little bit of a commentary on federalism, but when the Constitution was written, the idea was that states should be a prophylactic, a defensive mechanism, a guard against federal aggression. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that in many cases, state governments are happy to work hand in hand with the federal government. Things like COVID showed us this. And the police powers range all the way from the highest levels of government to your local dog catcher. Libertarians, lovers of freedom, know that government is quite literally the negation of freedom, the negation of liberty. And that's why it's so important that libertarians and generally Americans everywhere have their eyes open to the dangers of a quote-unquote benevolent government, a government that swears it's there to help you, to take care of you, to solve your problems. That's how we've gotten here, where we are today. And it makes no sense. At the federal level, I'm happy to say that we're also working, actually I should go back. At the state level, frankly, we've had tremendous success since 2014. A part of that is, we've been working very, very hard. The other part of it is that inflation is undeniable. It's a dinner time conversation. Mises said that a better metric than cooked government metrics. I'm paraphrasing. Mises, the Austrian-speaking Mises, did not say cooked. But a better metric than these cooked government statistics that we have today is a judicious housewife who has to go to the grocery store and tend for her family every week. That is a better metric of the price level, the price levels that we're seeing. And you can go back, going back to 2020, and then, of course, President Trump was in office then. But really, we saw the inflation, and to be sure, President Trump played a very big part in expanding the money supply. But it was really Biden's administration that began the shell game, because it was Jen Psaki who would go before her press gaggles and say, every single economist we've talked to says that there will have no effect on inflation. And then there was inflation. And y'all remember what came next. It's transitory. Y'all remember transitory? And then after it's transitory came, it's your greedy grocery store CEO. These people make too much money. And then after that, it's the Ukraine war. These oligarchs are causing car prices and food prices and energy prices. All of that. There's always a reason, without ever looking inward and realizing that it's the government's policies that perpetuate these problems. Again, this is not an act of God, and it was not an accident. So at the federal level, like I said, at the state level, because of the situation that we live in today, people are more tuned to gold and silver than they have been in recent history. On top of that, you have gold and silver, prices, doing things that we haven't seen in many decades. And people who are not necessarily attuned to financial news are suddenly saying, hey, wait, why is gold going up so much? And people are forced to answer these questions. And I'm happy to give you the answer. The reason that gold is going up so much is because central banks all over the world are buying gold as a hedge against inflation. They're doing so because they've realized after 2022, when the US seized Russian assets upon the invasion of Ukraine, adversaries of the United States and allies alike looked around and said, wait a second. You mean to tell me that if we piss those guys off, they can just cut us off? They can seize our assets? They can kick us out of the SWIFT system, which is the International Financial Settlement System? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. Yes, they can. And America has perverted and weaponized its currency for many decades now. And so rightfully so, frankly, like I said, enemies and allies of the United States are saying, wait a second, our balance sheets are completely chock full of US treasuries and things denominated, dollar-denominated assets. What if we had a money that was different? What if we had a money that was politically neutral? What if we had a money that was inflation-proof? And the reality is that they're not discovering that gold and silver are all of these things. They're rediscovering it. And they're all coalescing back around the greatest monetary asset that the world has ever seen for thousands of years. And that is why the price of gold is running. Because the world has turned its back on what has been decades of debt-fueled policies. And while America was lulled to sleep with credit inflation, with interest rate manipulation, and with deficit spending, the rest of the world said, wait a second, what if we stockpiled oil? What if we stockpiled gold? What if we stockpiled land? What if we stockpiled critical minerals? And now here we are. Here we are today. At the federal level, we've worked with heroes, Representative Thomas Massie, on legislation to audit America's gold. Because the reality is, despite what Secretary Bessent goes on TV on CNBC and says, America's gold is not audited. That is untrue. We've done the research. What they're doing is auditing schedules. What they're doing is walking up to the lockbox and saying, the lock is still on it. We're good. We don't need to look inside. Anyone who's in financial sector knows that that's not how audits are done. Additionally, audits are not one and done. They are ongoing. Yet, America cannot be troubled to audit its own gold supply, and the reality is that that's not America's gold supply, it's your gold supply. That gold belongs to American taxpayers, and the reason that there are so many, tin hat conspiracies about the gold at Fort Knox, frankly, is because the American government has not been forthcoming and has been extremely shady even about questions involving America's gold reserves. So the question of whether or not it's there is one question. But if we open the door and find that it is there, the questions aren't over. So if it is there, who owns it? Has it been pledged? Has it been leased? Has it been hypothecated in some way? There's been a lot of evidence that says that that may have happened. And if we're ever going to do something like tie our gold or our money back to gold or some sort of asset, the first thing you need to do is account for the gold. America supposedly, purportedly, has the world's greatest, largest gold reserve. Americans deserve to know the answers to those questions, and they haven't gotten them in decades. So we're working with Congressman Massie on that, and Senator Mike Lee on that as well. And so I say to you that gold and silver, both at the federal and state level, are winning. We're winning. More eyes are attuned to this problem of dollar devaluation, of government spending, of deficit spending, than there has been in the past. And it's so important. Libertarians have such an important voice here because libertarians have been so good on this issue and others for a very long time. Libertarians, of course, were first and best on war on drugs. Libertarians were talking about how people should be allowed to get married regardless of their sex long before Barack Obama switched from marriages between one man and one woman, which is what he started with on the campaign trail, to I'm open, I'm a progressive, anyone should be allowed to get married. Libertarians led on that. Importantly, libertarians have led and been a consistent anti-war voice. And you have another opportunity to do that right now. It's a shame because America was the greatest country in the world, and the founders created a governing document unlike anything the world had ever seen. And somehow, that country's been reduced to becoming a vassal state that fights wars on behalf of other countries. There is so much work to do. The Leviathan that is the state will continue to grow, and it has the ideology of a cancer cell, which is growth for the sake of growth. And it will not stop unless impeded. I encourage all of you to roll up your sleeves and be willing to do the work and to fight the fight and to be rabid in your pursuit of freedom. Thank you very much. Absolutely. So in North Carolina, House Bill 14 is the current bill. It is a bill that removes capital gains taxes on gold and silver. Like I mentioned, taxes are the largest point of friction, keeping people from using gold and silver as money. So to remove taxes at the state and federal level, to remove these designations of legal tender, and that's actually, I'm glad you set me off on this course. I want to talk about legal tender for a second, because this is a bit of an esoteric designation, but it's important to understand kind of how and where this began. You can go back to the days of Marco Polo in the 1500s to find the original legal tender type of laws, where a government took a currency that was backed or based in gold and silver and then said, no, we're going to replace this with paper or with seeds or with shells. And it's important to remember that legal tender, at least in the United States, was introduced as a means to fund the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, there was not enough gold, and so the Legal Tender Act had to be passed, because before that, there had to be the amount of gold in a safe somewhere to print more money. They were unable to do that, and so they came up with what they called legal tender, which is a magical government designation that imbues monetary properties on assets that don't actually have them. The reality is that if gold and silver were and are money, you wouldn't need legal tender status at all. I don't need the government to declare that gold and silver are money. They are money because the market told us so. On the other hand, legal tender status is a government alchemist waving a wand and saying that paper is now money. And that's complete nonsense. So to your question, Ryan, and thank you for asking it, in North Carolina here, like I said, taxes are the greatest impediment. And so to remove those taxes would be a huge step forward. House Bill 14 is a bill currently before, I believe, the House Finance Committee that would remove taxes, capital gains taxes on precious metals. That right now is the biggest piece of legislation we have in North Carolina, having already removed sales taxes on precious metals before. But we're also working with legislators there, hopefully in this upcoming session, to introduce bills to reaffirm gold and silver's constitutional status as money. And something we've been doing in other states is creating a gold reserve. You know, so many of these states like to pay lip service, and some of these politicians will talk about how gold and silver are great things. But the reality is that 99% of states don't own a single ounce of gold or silver. They have no concept of how to store it, how to value it, how to hold it as a reserve asset. So that's a big part of it, getting states used to, the financialization of gold and silver as a real asset. It's not just an ideological tool. It's not just something that's mentioned in the Constitution. It's not, as Paul Krugman called it, a barbarous relic. It is the greatest money the world has ever seen, and it constricts your government. It is twofold in that nature, and that's what makes it doubly important, because not only does it defend and safeguard our currency, but it also makes sure that these governments are not fighting wars all over the world, dropping bombs in places that most Americans can't find on maps. We're nearly $39 trillion in debt, and there show no signs of stopping. This thing will continue on. And frankly, Tom Woods said it. Doesn't matter who you vote for, you always get John McCain. So the anti-war candidate, the I'm not going to raise your tax candidate, is now waging yet another war of choice to the detriment of the American people. Gold and silver and this monetary stuff, it's very easy to relegate it to charts, supply and demand graphs, dot plots, but it's more than that. It's a communicative tool. It is the primary, other than maybe spoken word, it is the primary means by which human beings interact domestically and internationally. It's the way we should show our support for things. It's the way we withhold our support for things. It is a voice, and that really determines and that makes it so important that that tool of communication not be perverted and manipulated the way the Federal Reserve and the federal government regularly does.
Hey, one more time.